Welcome to The Sensitive One. I'm Gina Susan Long, nutritionist for highly sensitive people. And in this interview, you're going to hear me speaking with Dr. Paul Giacomin from James Cook University in Cairns. Paul works at the Australian Institute of Tropical Health and Medicine, investigating the effects of intestinal worms on the immune system. He also looks at the potential beneficial effects that intestinal worms may have in alleviating inflammation associated with autoimmune diseases like celiac disease and inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's and colitis. This idea that we would intentionally infect ourselves with worms for therapeutic reasons may sound strange at first, but one thing I've learned through studying and reading about helminthic therapy, which is, if you haven't picked up by now, the use of worms to treat certain diseases, is that maybe not all worms are bad, and at low levels some may even be good and beneficial to health, just like we can have healthy bacteria in our guts and bacteria that make us sick. We cover this and more in the interview if you want to understand more about this topic, and so without further ado, let me introduce Paul Giacomin. So maybe first of all, could you explain what a helminth is and what kind of research you do in relation to helminths?
Yeah, so helminths, or probably more commonly known as worms or parasitic worms, they're probably among the most common infectious organisms that affect humans and animals around the world. It's estimated around a third of the world, so 2 to 3 billion people are infected with some sort of species of helminths. Most of those infections occur in the developing regions of the world, tropical regions of the world in particular, so Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. And there's many different types of worms and helminths, many different species. In general, helminths aren't deadly by themselves, but certainly high numbers of helminths and worm infections, and we're talking hundreds or thousands of worms, causes major health problems in susceptible people. For example, children. So if children get a heavy helminth infection, it can affect their development, their growth, their cognitive development. So they're a big problem for people who are school age or younger, also pregnant women, and also people with other health conditions. So helminth infections have been with humans throughout our evolution. Our body has learnt to kind of live with worms, and generally, for most people, they're fairly asymptomatic. But nevertheless, as I said, it's still a major health problem. And most countries who have these helminth infections adopt these mass deworming regimens, where they give people deworming medications to clear these infections, and they're given routinely. These deworming medications are really effective. They generally can pretty much cure a person of worm infection. But what happens is, because these people live in areas where the worms and the eggs, for example, are in the environment, people keep continuously getting reinfected. So drugs really can control it, but it doesn't give long-lasting protection. And there are no vaccines to protect against worm infections. So pretty much at the start of my research career, I was sort of interested in tackling this question. Okay, so drugs aren't the answer to curing worm infections. How can we develop vaccines? So I'm an immunologist, so I was really interested in learning about what is the immune response to a parasitic worm. Why do some people develop immunity while others don't develop any immunity at all? And so if we can learn what constitutes a protective immune response, can we develop a vaccine, for example, that can kind of trigger the same sort of immune response and therefore limit the burden of these worm infections in these countries where where there are major health problems? So that's really, starting my PhD, that was really where my career was heading, trying to understand what is a protective immune response to a helminth. And if I carry on,
So where did you end up going with that?
So pretty much I spent the first 10 years of my research career using a combination of in vitro studies, animal models, worm infections of humans to try to understand, what are the particular cells of the immune system, what are the particular enzymes or cytokines that are important for protective immunity. And people have been working on these to develop better cures and preventative cures like vaccines for decades now, and still there still has been no protective vaccine released for humans. There's a few out there for animals, like especially domesticated animals or livestock, and they can be partly effective. But I think it's quite telling that we've been working on these vaccines and trying to boost our immunity to worms for decades and decades with no success. And I think a lot of that owes to the fact that these worms have been with us throughout our evolution. And in order to survive, these worms have had to evolve themselves to control the immune system around them. So these worms can live in a number of different tissues in the body. Most of my research has dealt with the ones that live in our gut, in our intestine. And a lot of the worms that I've been studying can live for years, if not a decade, within a fairly hostile environment, such as the gut. And they're fairly impervious to the immune response, which is concentrated on them. So it really shows a lot of the power of these helminths and how successful they are to be a fairly, in some cases, these worms can be quite small, around a centimetre long, but some of these worms, like tapeworms, for example, can be metres long, and still they can control the immune system and enhance their survival. So I spent a number of years looking at the protective immunity, but, there's relatively little evidence that protective immunity is really going to be easy to achieve in the context of vaccines. So when I returned, I did my PhD in Adelaide with Lindsay Dant, and I did a postdoc after I did my PhD in America for 4 years, where I continued to look at immunity to parasitic worms. And then I returned to Australia in 2012 to work with Professor Alex Lucas, who's definitely one of the world leaders in developing vaccines against parasitic worms. He's discovered a few of the lead candidate molecules, which are to treat hookworms or schistosomes, which are two of the most damaging or the most important pathogens of humans. And he discovered those, 10, 20 years ago, and only now they're entering, some of these phase 1 clinical trials. So it takes a long time to develop vaccines. But I joined his group to sort of continue working on immunity to worms, but also in the time that, in the few years before I moved the lab, he started to, change his research program to looking at, how can we learn a bit about the power of these worms to control the immune system. And the fact that these worms can control immune responses in various tissues, in particular the gut, can this have some potentially beneficial side effects for people who may suffer from inflammatory diseases? So in particular, diseases that he was interested in were things like inflammatory bowel disease, like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. And these diseases are really quite severe diseases where there is no cure. For some reason, your immune system starts attacking your intestinal wall, and causes inflammation in your gut, and which is kind of like an autoimmune reaction in your gut. And one of the hypotheses around this research program is that if you can introduce something into the gut which is professional at suppressing immune responses, maybe this might be a fairly rational way and a logical way to suppress this inflammation which is causing damage to the gut wall. So he was interested in inflammatory bowel disease, but also celiac disease, which is a somewhat related inflammatory condition of the gut. But the thing about celiac disease is we kind of know what cures it. It's an autoimmune reaction to gluten, which is a fairly common ingredient in a lot of staple diet in people who live in a Western diet, for example, breads and pasta. And so people who have celiac disease, whenever they eat a gluten-containing meal, the gluten gets broken down, and for some reason in these people it gets broken down into little peptides, like tiny bits of proteins, and these proteins in people with celiac disease are quite toxic because they provoke an inflammatory reaction which causes a similar kind of inflammation in the gut and attacking your intestinal wall. And no one really quite knows why in people with celiac disease this causes the inflammatory reaction, and while people like myself who don't have celiac disease, we can eat gluten quite happily. But it's clearly a breakdown in what we call tolerance of the immune system. So So for some reason, people with celiac disease are intolerant to gluten. And whatever, for example, when people don't have celiac disease, whatever sort of puts the brakes on the immune response or induces tolerance to gluten is somehow broken. And therefore you get this inflammation. And it's kind of similar to people who have food allergies, for example. People with peanut allergies, for some reason, this tolerance or this suppressive arm of the immune response is not functioning correctly, and you get this inflammatory reaction. So we were particularly interested in, okay, how can we harness the power of these parasitic worms to potentially develop new cures for inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, like I mentioned, but we're also interested in allergies as well. And this is off the back. The idea sort of stemmed from a couple of seminal research papers from the mid 2000s. The first ones were done in the US, looking at fairly groundbreaking clinical trials where they're infecting people who had inflammatory bowel disease with the eggs of what's called a pig whipworm. And this is a Trichuris suis. And the theory behind these trials is that you can give people this pig whipworm, which is not a native pathogen for humans. But the hypothesis was that you give these people this pig whipworm eggs, it will cause the same sort of immune response in the person. These eggs will go to the gut, they'll cause an immune response, and that, in theory, might be able to suppress inflammation, but it won't cause an active infection because it's a pig parasite. So the egg eventually gets cleared from the host, and therefore it might be a safer, more tolerable, and potentially more medicinal treatment for inflammatory diseases. So there's a couple of nice, very small clinical trials done in colitis and Crohn's disease, which really gave a boost to the potential, scientific integrity of this idea that you can give people worms to potentially cure inflammatory diseases of the gut. But again, these trials were very small, and they weren't your gold standard clinical trials where you have a placebo group or you have hundreds of people. These were very small trials with a dozen or so people, but nevertheless they were quite encouraging. And around the same time, our research collaborators here in Australia had kind of got onto the same idea, and instead of using a non-adapted pig parasite, they thought maybe a human parasite like a hookworm, Nicator americanus, might be a more appropriate way to go, and for a number of reasons. The first one is that, in theory, you'd imagine that giving a human-adapted parasite like the human hookworm might be more adapted to controlling human immune responses. So if you give a low dose of these hookworms to a person, we know that less than 20 parasites is fairly well tolerated, and this is going back for research for a number of decades. But also these parasites can live within the host for years, so you don't need to continuously dose the person with more and more parasites. Give the person a dose, they go to the intestine, and then they can live for a number of years. And in theory, they're by surviving in the gut, they're controlling the immune system around them, and therefore you might be able to have some beneficial side effects of having this worm infection. And back in the mid-2000s, this research was led by Dr. John Kruse in Townsville and later Brisbane. And he was, again, another pioneer in this research field. Conducted another very small clinical trial involving, I think, less than 10 people. But again, saw similarly encouraging results where they took people with Crohn's disease, infected them with these hookworms, and saw that their Crohn's disease activity index went down. They were quite well tolerated. And when they dewormed the people, you lose this potential protection. But again, it was a fairly small clinical trial, but really opened up a lot of the potential for using worms as a potential therapy, and gave it a bit of scientific integrity because it had been hypothesized for a number of years, but those trials really gave it a bit of a kickstart. And my research sort of came in about 8 to 10 years ago, where we turned our attention to celiac disease, which is that gluten-sensitive disease I mentioned before. And John Kruse and Alex Lucas led the first clinical trial, where it was a really robust trial. It involved a placebo group, so people with celiac disease who were untreated, and compared that with people who were infected with low doses of this human hookworm. So they infected the people or not and let the infection establish for, I think, about 20 weeks. And then what they did is they gave them a gluten challenge. So they gave them 2 slices of bread, which I think is around 16 grams of gluten, and then tracked them over the course of a week and had a look at their symptoms, levels of inflammation in their gut and in their blood. And what they found with this early trial is that hookworms didn't protect at all, really. Everyone got sick, regardless of whether they got the placebo treatment or they got the hookworms. And they owed this to the fact that giving a person, who'd been on a gluten-free diet for years, potentially, giving them 2 slices of bread, just, it was fairly abrupt and quite aggressive gluten challenge, and no treatment that you give to someone has ever been shown to suppress that. So they really thought that the approach taken with that trial was not appropriate. And nevertheless, what they did was when they studied the immune response in these people, even though that people felt sick, they found that the immune responses that were detected in the people who had the hookworms were suppressed compared to the placebo-treated people. So even though there were people who were still getting sick, there was evidence that the hookworms were suppressing the inflammation in the gut and in the blood. So again, even though it was kind of a bit of a failure of a trial, we still learned a lot about, how could a worm potentially protect against celiac disease. So I was involved in the follow-up trial, which was run in 2012 and 2013, and the idea changed. So what we wanted to do is give people worm infection, and instead of giving them an abrupt, heavy gluten challenge, can we gradually reintroduce gluten into the diet of these people, starting at a low level? And the idea was that potentially having a parasitic worm in your gut sets up an environment and boosts this potential tolerance immune response, this suppressive immune response, so that as you gradually reintroduce something like gluten, potentially you're going to boost your tolerance level to gluten. And if you gradually escalate, maybe that is sufficient to prevent you getting symptoms. Now, this trial was designed, it was what's called an open label study, and it was fairly small study. Again, it was only 12 people, and everyone got worms. So it had its limitations, so there was no placebo group. But what we did is we structured the trial so that we gave everyone worms and we gave them gluten challenges, which based on the literature, based on what other people have done before, we're giving people gluten challenges that we knew would make people, have reactions. So we started at a low level, which should make around 50% of people sick. And then we gradually escalated to a challenge at the end of the trial, which we would predicted that would have made pretty much most people with celiac disease would have had a reaction. So we embarked on this trial. We gave everyone worms. We allowed them to establish. And we started challenging them with around 10 to 50 milligrams of spaghetti. So this is about 2 to 5 centimeters of normal spaghetti. So it's a very small amount of spaghetti, and then the participants were asked to eat this small amount every day for 12 weeks. So we could carefully monitor their symptoms and whether they were having a reaction. And I guess to our surprise, all of the participants tolerated this level of gluten quite well. And this was based on careful safety monitoring, looking at inflammatory markers. There was no evidence of inflammation in the intestine. So then we escalated to giving the people gluten challenge with 1 gram twice a week, which is a fairly substantial amount of gluten. So we're talking, I think it's about 16 or 20 spaghetti straws twice a week. But we found again that everyone who embarked on this challenge, this what we call medium gluten challenge, tolerated incredibly well. 10 of 10 who embarked on this challenge, so 100%, there was no evidence of autoimmune antibodies, there was no damage to their intestine. All of the participants recorded their well-being and their symptom indices, and if anything, they improved. So that was supposed to be the end of the trial, and we thought, wow, this is really surprising. We're giving people, a gram of gluten every day, and they're not having a reaction, and if anything, they're feeling better. So we went back and said, can we push it a little bit further? So we went back to the ethics committee, and we asked if we could give them a more abrupt and more aggressive gluten challenge. So this was 2 grams every day for 2 weeks, and this was in line with what some of the gold standard trials are going on overseas for various celiac treatments. So we gave them 2 grams every day for 2 weeks. And again, when we had a look after this gluten challenge, the 8 people who embarked on this challenge, all 8 felt quite well. There was no evidence of inflammation. And at that stage, we thought, we've found a cure here. We've given people a treatment. These people can now eat gluten again. And have we stumbled upon a potential cure where if you give people a worm infection, you can effectively gradually reintroduce gluten into their diet up to a fairly reasonable level. We're talking like a medium bowl of pasta every day. And these people are having no ill effects whatsoever. We published this study in 2015 under full acknowledgement that it had a lot of limitations. The limitations was quite small. It was only 12 people. And the main limitation is that there was no placebo group. So basically, everyone got worms. So there's a potential that there's some sort of placebo effect of giving people a gluten challenge. So some sort of mysterious placebo effect. But also in our mind that no one's really ever tried gradually reintroducing gluten into the diet, even without worms, in that sort of approach. So, in the back of our mind, we thought maybe just gradually reintroducing gluten at a low level and escalating it, even without worms, might be able to boost your tolerance. And this was not unprecedented. People have tried these approaches for, food allergies, for example, peanut allergies. And also, at the same time as we were doing our studies, research groups in Melbourne were developing what's called a celiac vaccine, where they've identified the particular toxic gluten peptides, which supposedly make people sick. And the approach there was to gradually expose people to these gluten peptides to hopefully build tolerance. So it's kind of along the lines of what we were doing. We were obviously giving people the whole gluten in spaghetti. And those people, as researchers at the Walter Eliza Hall, led by Bob Anderson and Jason Tydin, they were giving people this potential vaccine to boost tolerance. So, no, nevertheless, the study got a lot of attention and built a lot of hope that either giving worms and or giving low doses of gluten, either in combination or alone, might be a potential solution for boosting tolerance in celiac disease. So after the study, we sort of used this as proof of principle that we can now go on to a more robust clinical trial, which would involve a placebo group, a bigger number of people. And so we went on and got support from the Australian NHMRC and Celiac Australia and Far North Queensland Hospital Foundation, a lot of support from the celiac community as well as Australian research organisations to conduct this trial. And we recently completed it. It involved 54 people from Australia or New Zealand at Christchurch Hospital, but also Townsville Hospital, Prince Charles Hospital and Logan Hospital. So there were 54 people and they're all randomized to either receive a placebo treatment or 20 hookworms or 40 hookworms, which are all applied to the skin. And then after 12 weeks, we started with the same regiment of gluten challenge as we did with the previous trial, starting at that very low level, the 2 or 3 centimeters of spaghetti, and escalating at the end of the trial, which went for a year, with 2 grams of spaghetti for 6 weeks. And throughout the trial, we regularly monitored these people's disease through, wellbeing surveys, but we also took blood samples and also biopsy samples of their intestine to really predict whether the challenges were well tolerated, or also, for safety monitoring, making sure that there was no evidence of inflammation. And therefore, in the evidence of inflammation, we would obviously stop the trial for these people and they'd be removed from the study. And the main outcome, or the primary outcome of this study, was, can you basically cure celiac disease? Does treatment with hookworms enable you to eat 2 grams of spaghetti a day for 6 weeks with no adverse symptoms?
Is it two grams of spaghetti or 2 grams
2
of
grams
gluten?
of gluten, sorry. Yes, 2 grams of gluten, which was, I can't remember how many spaghetti straws, maybe 75 spaghetti straws or something like that. 60 to 75 spaghetti straws constitutes about 2 grams of gluten, and they had to eat this every day for 6 weeks. So, and our theory was that the people who had the placebo treatment would drop out of the trial early, and then the people with the hookworm treatment would potentially have improved tolerance and reduced inflammation in their gut. Now, as it turns out, to be fairly upfront, we did not cure celiac disease with the most recent trial. So regardless of whether you got the hookworm treatment or placebo treatment, giving person 2 grams a day of spaghetti for 6 weeks caused a large number of dropouts. So around 50% of people had to drop out early due to either feeling unwell or developing inflammation in their gut. So basically 50% of the placebos dropped out and 50% of the people with hookworm dropped out. So there's really no difference. So our primary outcome we did not meet. We did not have the cure for celiac disease, which was obviously somewhat disappointing, but again, we are working with a disease where no one really has developed a cure yet. There is no cure other than adhering to a strict gluten-free diet. But we were very careful with this trial that we structured it because we were giving different doses of gluten, starting at a low level and gradually escalating. And after every 6 to 12 weeks, we were getting the participants back in and assessing them. It wasn't just a primary outcome we're interested in. We were interested in whether the hookworms can protect against the lower amounts of gluten. And that's particularly important because you may not be a celiac disease person may not be able to eat a normal diet, for example. But if you can provide some sort of treatment that can give some peace of mind that if they accidentally eat a small amount of gluten, either if they go out to a restaurant or go to a party and eat the level of in the milligrams or 1 gram of gluten accidentally, if you can protect against adverse symptoms and vomiting, for example, that'll obviously be beneficial for people who are suffering from celiac disease. So what we did find in our study is that while we can't protect against a high dose of gluten, we found that the people who did have the hookworm infection and the appropriate immune response to worm infections did tend to have better tolerance to lower levels of gluten. And this is the levels around less than 1 gram of gluten twice a week. And this was characterized by less physical symptoms. So these people didn't have as many reports of gastrointestinal pain, diarrhea, vomiting, and bloating. So those were significantly reduced in the people who had the worm infection treatment.
Can you also quantify how much that is? So that was 1 gram twice a week of gluten. How much?
Yeah, so the main benefits were for people who were eating 10 to 50 milligrams every day, but we challenged them twice a week with a 1 gram. So it was kind of an intermittent challenge. It wasn't a regular challenge. So it was similar to what we did in the previous trial. Certainly both groups tolerated the very low levels of gluten quite well. We're talking around 90% of people, even in the placebo group, they tolerated eating less than 50 milligrams okay. It wasn't until you started to introduce this 1 gram twice a week that you started to see some benefits of the worms, and you started to see the unprotected people, the people who didn't have the hookworms, started to have some symptoms. So people were feeling a bit better. So there were less of these adverse events. Their celiac symptom scores, so every week or every month they had to produce these surveys which ask questions, and you had to score 1 to 5 how you're feeling based on how you feel about your celiac disease, how you're feeling, how your energy levels are, issues of well-being, for example. We found that people with the hookworms generally had improved well-being and celiac disease symptoms, while the unprotected people did not. And they were they were probably the most interesting outcomes we found. So the people who had the hookworms tended to stick it out the trial a little bit longer. But of course, at the end of the trial, people were dropping out regardless of hookworm treatment. So we found this kind of nice little window where, while worms may not protect against celiac disease, there is a certain level of gluten that they might be beneficial. And we're certainly trying to learn more about why that is now. As part of the study, we collected blood samples as well as gut biopsy samples, and we can start to apply advanced molecular techniques to find out, okay, in this cohort of people who got the worm infection and did have some sort of boosted tolerance to gluten, is there any clues in their blood or in their intestinal samples, if we look at their immune response, about why they had a boosted tolerance, but the people who'd failed the challenges didn't? So we can sort of use this as a rational way to understand what kind of biological pathways are associated with improved gluten tolerance. And this will guide potential future trials with this treatment, but also help the celiac community, the celiac research community, understand what kind of immune pathways should you trigger and promote to try to help people with celiac disease restore their tolerance to gluten. And that was kind of the main outcome of that study. And at this stage, we don't have any follow-up study planned. based on the fact that we would never go on and do a larger, phase 2 trial at this stage. Part of the reason is that it's hard to raise funding for a large phase 2 study when you're using, basically a natural product which has relatively little intellectual property associated with it. It's a natural product. It's drug companies aren't necessarily interested in producing at this stage, producing it as a medicinal-like product. And also, at this stage, hookworms themselves can't be produced in a standard high quality that it could ever, at this stage, be produced as a therapy. What basically the regulatory authorities would consider a therapy. Basically it's a product which is purified from human poo. And yes, we do disinfect it and use good laboratory practice to produce the infective larvae under very careful conditions. But you can imagine that upscaling this and turning it into a therapy that is widely acceptable to be produced under what's called good manufacturing practice or GMP conditions, we're not there yet. So we're not really ready at this stage to really advance this hookworm treatment as a therapy. We have some ideas about how that could be potentially done, and making it more medicinal-like worm that might be beneficial for some people. But at this stage, we haven't got any firm plans.
Okay, so it sounds like from what you're saying that there's not money really available to research this as there would be if it was a pharmaceutical product that could be sold by a drug company.
Not at this stage. I mean, look, we think in the back of my mind, if we've got a treatment which is going to help people, if for some people it may not cure everyone, but if you can make a worm under very carefully produced conditions, like people do with pharmaceuticals, or there is precedence for GMP leeches and maggots, for example, for treating non-healing wounds, for example, and other conditions. So you can make these natural products under very strict manufacturing conditions and really make a product which will get potentially FDA or TGA approval by the authorities as a medicinal product. And we're not there yet with the hookworms. But if we can do that, there is potential that we could make a product that might be able to treat people. And at that stage, if we can prove that we can do that, then some companies might be interested in producing a live worm if it can be produced in a very standardized way, where we can guarantee the quality of and the safety of these parasites. If we have a very defined way of showing that they're effective. We don't want to produce a product and then find you can't really tell whether it's protective or not. So there has to be some sort of guarantee of quality and an indication that it is effective for people. We're pretty sure it's safe. We've done these trials and they've been done all over the world for a number of conditions, other more autoimmune or allergic conditions. And there is certainly around 1 to 5% of people who can't tolerate these worms. In the initial stage of getting infected with a hookworm, in the first 2 to 6 weeks, it does cause fairly predictable intestinal pain, moderate to mild, and most people, that subsides. And after they're established in the gut, they live, without symptom-free for a number of years. However, there is that 1 to 5% of people who can't tolerate it. It causes moderate to even greater levels of discomfort. And these people, whenever they tell us this as part of the carefully controlled clinical setting, we can quickly care for them, tell them to take the deworming medication, and their symptoms go away immediately. So we can, in a carefully controlled clinical context, we're allowed to do these trials because you can eradicate the worms, and we're checking on people very regularly. Our nurses are very good at monitoring people's symptoms. But you can imagine if this therapy becomes more widespread, it's more difficult and would have to be done in a very carefully monitored setting by a GP, for example, with regular blood tests, for example, to show that you're not getting some sort of adverse effects. I'm not saying it's never going to happen. It might happen one day in future. Just need a little bit more research and to hopefully turn it into a more medicinal-like product. And then you might start to get potential for commercial development down the line. And that's our hope. I mean, probably 50% of our research is devoted to this potential live worm therapy at the moment. But our research laboratory in Cairns is very well equipped to look at it from another side. The genome of this hookworm was published by a number of collaborators about 5 years ago. So we know everything, every protein that this worm produces, every enzyme, for example. And our research group is, a lot of our projects at the moment is having a look at, okay, we know the worm makes 300 proteins and releases these into the human body during the infection. Can we now start to mine these 300 proteins and identify which specific proteins are causing this, immunoregulatory effects? And we've started doing this as part of, some work that's been done here in Cairns, and we've got ideas. We've got some candidate molecules which we know in preclinical studies can target the immune system. We're starting to understand how they do this. We've published one of these a number of years ago in an allergy model, but that's another arm of our research at the moment, is making more conventional drug-like products that are based on the parasitic worm, but they're biologics, they're recombinant proteins, which could be more attractive for commercial development. And we've had industry support for a couple of these in the past, and we're still actively trying to promote this potential therapies that are based on the worm but don't require you to be infected with a live worm.
And do the hookworms change the gut microbiota? Because I did notice you had a study out about that, looking at that in relation to celiac disease.
Yeah, so I mentioned that worms release proteins which might be able to have the therapeutic effect. But the other theory is that beneficial effects of worms might be indirect. So if you introduce, an animal effectively into the environment of the gut, it can potentially change the environment. And one of the key features of the environment of the gut is our commensal bacteria or a microbiome. And we had this idea a number of years ago, and a number has had. So as part of the previous trial, hypothesis is maybe giving these people worms is changing the nature of the bacteria in the gut. And we know that these bacteria are really central for our gut health and or gut disease. And so we did a number of fairly small studies, and we did see that there was some sort of trends towards improved richness or diversity of bacteria in the gut following hookworm treatment, but the studies were too small to really provide definitive evidence. But in the meantime, a number of studies around the world have looked in other models, either giving people worms or deworming people does have a quite substantial change in the gut microbiome. So there's a lot of evidence there that part of the reason why a worm might protect is that it changes the balance of good and, I guess, bad bacteria in the gut. And therefore, that might be obviously a downstream effect of improving inflammation. For celiac disease, we think it would be really interesting if giving people worms might affect the composition of the bacteria in the gut, which normally break down gluten. Obviously you've got gluten is normally broken down by the bacteria in your gut, and maybe people with celiac disease don't have the right type of bacteria to break down gluten appropriately, and therefore you get these immunogenic sort of toxic gluten peptides. So we're really interested in looking at these samples, like I mentioned before, from the current trial. Are there very specific changes in the microbiome that happen in the people who develop tolerance compared to the people who didn't? Because if we can have a look to see if there's a particular bacteria which is more abundant in the people who develop tolerance, that's another potential avenue for treating celiac disease, giving people these kind of symbiotic gluten breakdown promoting bacteria as more of like a probiotic or prebiotic therapy for celiac disease.
And with the more recent study that you've brought out, were you able to look at whether the micro challenge of the gluten, so introducing it slowly, was also helping people to develop tolerance, or was it not really structured for you to be able to look at that?
It wasn't powered enough, so we only had 7 people in that cohort. But nevertheless, we found that the tolerance of these 7 people who didn't have hookworms, who had been on a gluten-free diet for at least 6 months, was surprising. So we had 4 of these 7 people completing the trial with no symptoms at all. There was a little bit of evidence of deterioration of their gut. There was, increased inflammatory cells in their gut. slight reductions in what's called the villus height crypt depth ratio, which is really the key diagnostic marker for celiac disease. But we were really surprised that these unprotected people had the level of tolerance that they did. Nevertheless, 3 of them dropped out early. So, you certainly weren't curing all people, but there is potential for expanding on this fairly natural way to boost tolerance. For some people, it might actually be beneficial. So obviously some people could not tolerate a very small amount, but we're going to use the samples and the information we gained from that trial, even looking at the people who didn't get the hookworms. Why did these 4 people tolerate the gluten so well? What's changed in their gut or their blood after you gradually reintroduce gluten into their diet? Is there something we can learn there? And is it similar to what people are seeing with these gluten vaccine trials? So maybe for people with celiac disease, being on a strict gluten-free diet, avoiding gluten at all costs, may not be the best way to manage your disease. Maybe you need to potentially, we've got no evidence of this at this stage, but maybe just keeping people on a very small amount of gluten every day to keep your level of tolerance to an accidental gluten challenge in control. This trial gives some sort of evidence towards that, but again, it was based on very small sample size. And if I was to do another trial, I would probably design, I'd be interested in doing a trial, giving people a little bit of spaghetti every day, structuring a trial to see if there is something to this. If you can manage celiac disease in a very natural way by giving people just a small amount of gluten, of course, it needs to be done under very carefully monitored conditions. I wouldn't encourage people with celiac disease to go out and try this. But in the carefully controlled clinical setting, while we're still working out the various, parameters about how you can do this, it might be a good idea to potentially pursue this in future.
Yeah, so it's kind of really along the same lines as the immunotherapies that they do, desensitizing people to food allergies like peanuts and that kind of thing.
Exactly. So, the peanut allergy studies, which, providing amazing results at the moment. That's some of the work that's been going on in Australia and around the world to desensitizing to food allergies. It might be the same sort of mechanisms there. And that might be a potential way. It may not help everyone, but this sort of complete avoidance of allergens or, things like gluten might not be, for some people, might not be the best way to live your life and maintain your diet, because then you leave yourself, susceptible. If you do accidentally get exposed to peanuts or exposed to gluten, there's no level of protection or tolerance that you've built up in your immune system because you've constantly been avoiding this stimuli.
Yeah, well, that would be great if that did work, because I know people who have celiac disease and they get very sick if they have even just, a small amount of contamination. Yeah.
Yeah.
So overall, do you think that from the research that you've done, do you think that there is any benefit to people using helminths to treat things like celiac disease or just to reduce their sensitivity?
Yeah, if I was to design another trial, I would really want to really focus in on developing a therapy that could give people peace of mind that if they accidentally do get exposed to a lower level of gluten, they're not going to get symptoms. And our most recent trial with a reasonably good number of people showed that if you've got a hookworm infection, you've got the right sort of immune response, and you're maintaining a little bit of gluten in your diet every day, you can tolerate gluten quite well. All right? So potentially that's probably how we'd, in future, if we were to do future trials and, clinical development, it could be a product which would give people peace of mind. And, people with celiac disease need that, because right now there's nothing really available other than a strict gluten-free diet. So it could be a combination therapy. It could be giving people a little bit of gluten every day, and potentially giving the worm on top might boost the tolerance, because it's like a tolerizing agent. Like those peanut allergy therapies, they use like a particular bacteria as a tolerizing agent. In this case, we're using a worm which might change the microbiome a little bit. It might release anti-inflammatory molecules into the gut, live for a number of years, and provide you with that sort of peace of mind that you're going to have a reduced risk of developing, symptoms if you do accidentally eat a small amount of gluten. But we can't, at this stage, get people back to eating a normal diet.
Do you think that a longer trial might produce different results with the hookworms? I interviewed one person actually with a personal experience that said that it took 18 months to see a change in food allergies.
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't mention before the main clinical study was 1 year. And what we did at the end of that trial was we had an optional extension to the trial where it was another year of the study, and this is what phase just finished. People who got infected with the hookworms are allowed to go away and eat a liberal diet for a year. And this was based around the same sort of thing. Does it take longer to develop tolerance? And after over the course of 2 years, are we seeing a benefit? And people were eating over 10 grams of gluten a day. But what we found is that of the, I think, 16 people who entered this phase, only 4 people made it to the full year. And that was good for them. They felt great. But the 12 people failed within the first month of eating a liberal diet. So it's really hard at this stage to know. I mean, this is a fairly long study. This is 2 years. So I think if we saw any potential benefit, we would hopefully have seen it within that 2-year window. But there might be some evidence of slow emergence of tolerance. But I think within the framework of a normal clinical study, I don't think we're going to follow up of the people in the previous trial because we gave the people the option whether they want to keep their worms at the end of the previous trial or deworm. Most people kept their worms, so there is potential in future we could follow up with people, see how they're feeling, see how their diet is, or potentially give them another gluten challenge in future to see if there is some sort of longer term benefits of the worm.
And with the more recent study that you just completed, you said that you had two groups. One had 20 hookworm and the other one had 40. Was there any difference between the doses?
No, they're equivalent.
Okay.
So we didn't really see any obvious difference. And in our final analysis, we really ended up combining them because there was really no difference. We were concerned about going too high with the dose. The reason why we included the 40 was a dose escalation. And can we, exactly answer that question? Just keep giving people a higher dose of worms mean you get a more robust treatment, a more robust immune response? We found the immune response was fairly similar with 20 or 40 worms. There was no difference in adverse events. They were both equally well tolerated. The level of gluten was the same. And since we did this trial, people are now giving much higher doses of worms. So there's vaccine studies or as well as therapeutic trials where people are giving 75 or even 100 worms, getting really reliable infections in people with no more adverse events than you get with 20 worms. So, of course, down the line, we might want to try a higher dose to see if giving more worms might potentially give a better therapy. We were concerned because we're fairly kind of pioneers in this field. We didn't want to go too high and then find that the treatment is not safe. But other people around the world, particularly in the Netherlands, are giving much higher doses and getting very good safety profiles, very reliable infections. And, that sort of treatment might be what you could try in future.
And were there any unexpected benefits? Did people find that they felt better in general? Were there any other effects that just weren't actually part of what you were looking for?
Yeah, I think the main one was I mentioned before that we got people to complete a weekly or monthly health and well-being survey. Both of them are fairly celiac centric, but there's a lot of questions relating to general well-being and energy and happiness, for example. And it really was only in the people who had the worm infections that we saw actual improvements. It wasn't that it was stable. We actually saw improvements in mood, improvements in ability to sleep, improvements in energy, for example. And we can't really explain it right now, but we saw exactly the same thing with our trial we did in 2012. It was an open label study, of course. But again, we saw the same sort of trends that the people with the worms felt happier and they felt energetic and they were motivated. And we're sort of following this up again now. We've got a trial in people who are at risk of type 2 diabetes. So one of the emerging areas of research at the moment is how worms might affect your metabolism. And this might, again, be all via the microbiome. So studies have shown that people with worms in worm endemic countries, people with worms are less likely to have diabetes-like symptoms. And if you deworm these people, their metabolism gets worse. So there's a lot of anecdotal and some experimental evidence that worms might potentially improve your metabolism. So we're doing a trial now in Cairns at the moment, looking to see if you take people who are at risk of type 2 diabetes, people who are overweight and have other metabolic dysfunction, can you give them people a worm, track them over the course of 2 years, and to see Does this affect your progression to type 2 diabetes? Does it improve your metabolism, help you lose weight, improve your well-being, for example? So that's a trial that's involving about 45 people at the moment. And, a key part of that study is looking at people's well-being and health and regularly monitoring their diet, for example, to see how, some of these potential beneficial effects of worms on well-being and health are real, because there's a lot of links between the gut and the brain. There's gut-brain axis at the moment. Is there some sort of potential, mysterious or uncharacterized benefit of giving people a worm that might be beneficial for people's well-being and mood in diseases like depression, for example? Is there a potential other therapeutic avenue that we could potentially be looking at in the future? No one's looked at the moment, but just gathering evidence at this stage.
So something that's really interesting hearing all of this, and also looking at some of the research that I've seen myself, where they have found that when they deworm people in countries where worms are endemic, that there was an increase in allergic response. So I saw one study that was looking at this. I think it was in Africa.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes us think about our practices where we deworm children. We think that that's that's a healthy thing to do. Does this change that? Should it change our perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question. I think in regions of the world, like, for example, Africa, as you mentioned, you've got worms like, the deworming study, very seminal papers done in Gabon, and trying to remove these schistosome parasites and showing that you get more atopic disease, right? They're very clear results, have been followed up. Depending on the study, you get some sort of benefits. In some deworming study, there's no difference in allergies, but there is some evidence that, deworming can worsen allergic symptoms. And there's also been studies where people have given worms and seeing if it reduces asthma symptoms or allergic symptoms, and with fairly kind of unclear results as well. So there's some evidence there that worms may suppress allergy. But in terms of whether we should be deworming or not and changing policy, I think in places like Africa, for example, where worms probably do more harm than good, we should definitely continue to try to eradicate worms, because they cause a number of debilitating symptoms for people, and for schistosomes, they can kill 60,000 people a year. So we need to continue this mass deworming of people until we can get a vaccine against worms. So in regions of the world like that, continue the deworming. But in regions of the world like in the developed world, where worms are not particularly prevalent, and where the worms we get exposed to are things like pinworm, maybe a little bit of strongyloides or something in Australia, there's not really a whole lot of evidence that deworming is really beneficial. I know that there's researchers from the Menzies Institute in Darwin, I think, are looking at, deworming in remote Aboriginal communities in Australia and seeing if there is any difference or any health benefits. And I don't know what those results are, but in places like Australia, where the worms that we have are not necessarily that damaging, you may be potentially, I mentioned before about, deworming can worsen your metabolism. It could potentially make you have more allergic symptoms. Potentially you are maybe doing more harm than good. But at this stage, there hasn't been enough research to really change the policy. But it might come in future. We might find that these mass deworming regimens that are happening in regions of the world where worms aren't a huge problem, you are potentially doing more harm than good.
And it's probably a good opportunity to clarify that there are different types of worms, and some of them seem to be more beneficial or even mutualistic or whatever you want to call it than others. So do we maybe need more discernment? If we are doing this research and we're understanding which worms actually provide benefits, does that potentially help us to be more selective?
Absolutely. And I think, in regions of the world like Africa or Southeast Asia, people can have 3 or 4 different types of worms. And, there's certain worms you certainly don't want to get too high numbers, like schistosomes, as I mentioned. If you've got hundreds of hookworms, for example, you need to deworm. But a low number of any type of worm generally is fairly well tolerated. So I think the key is a little bit more personalized medicine if someone's got a very low level hookworm infection or a pinworm infection, for example, they're annoying potentially, but potentially you don't need to necessarily eradicate them because you don't really know what potential benefit they may be actually embarking because no one's really done the research. But yes, improved diagnostics and tailoring, medical treatments based on, the number of worms or the types of worms that you have. And in Australia, you're not going to get too many different types of worms. There's a very small amount of hookworm, a little bit of strongyloides, and there's a bit of pinworm. So you can fairly clearly define what parasites you've got. And if it is deemed like it's not doing any harm, then you may be better off not deworming in places of the world where you can define what infectious pathogens you've got.
And when we first started talking, you mentioned that you were looking at different responses to helminths. So some people were more resistant to them than
Mm-hmm.
others. There's obviously an individual difference as well in terms of how we respond to a worm infection. So is that part of it too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as an immunologist, I'm really interested in these carefully controlled clinical trials we've been doing in people who've never had a hookworm before, right? So a lot of back, years ago when we were understanding the immune response to worms, it was always done in animal models, for example, which is not really a great model of human infections, but also people from the field, people who are infected with worms, but might also be infected with other bacteria and viruses and stuff. So a lot of what we learned about the immune response was really from fairly complex or not really appropriate models. So as an immunologist, I'm really interested in these human challenge studies because it has an advantage to understanding how people respond to an infectious pathogen the first time, looking at, what is the typical immune response, but, what are the other types of immune response? And can we sort of predict in the context of vaccine design what particular immune responses are potentially protective, but also in therapeutic design, what potential immune responses might be more inclined to suppressing inflammation. So there's been quite an emergence of a number of these pathogen challenge studies around the world, and they're not just hookworms. People are doing pathogen challenges with malaria parasites, influenza, etc. So there's been an emergence of these studies, which is really accelerating the development and our understanding of human health and disease, and will lead to better designs of therapeutics, deworming and anti-parasitic agents, vaccines, and also better fundamental understanding of the immune response to pathogens and how it differs between people.
And what does a good immune response look like? Do people that have a good immune response tend to get better results from using them?
Well, that's a bit of an oxymoron because I think if you've got a really good immune response to a parasite, and we know what constitutes a good immune response to a worm, you get this what's called a type 2 immune response. And in your gut, it produces a lot of mucus and a lot of squeezing of the gut tissue, and you expel the worms quickly. So that's a really good immune response. But if you're getting that sort of immune response, you don't get infected with a worm very long, so you're not going to have
Okay.
the benefits of getting the parasite. So the parasite, the hookworm is very clever because it can suppress that type 2 immune arm. It boosts this immunosuppressive arm of the immune response, the regulatory immune response. Parasites have evolved this really interesting kind of mutualistic kind of benefit where it benefits the host, where the parasite doesn't really damage the host so much. They take what they need, they feed on the gut wall, they take a little bit of blood, but they don't really induce too much damage. And the host benefits because the host doesn't direct a really vigorous immune response against the parasite. And then the host benefits by not obviously getting pathology associated with the worm and maybe all these other potential benefits of having a anti-inflammatory parasite in your gut. So we think that the best type of immune response to a parasite is one that limits the number of parasites in your body to a level that you're not getting pathology, but potentially keeping the parasite around so that you get this sort of symbiotic relationship between the host and the parasite.
Do you get people writing to you to tell you about their experiences with using helminths for therapy?
Yeah, I mean, over the last, probably since we published the first study about 5 years or so, yeah, every now and then I get some really, really good stories of people, anecdotal stories that they tell me that they've been trying worms and it's really helped them, or it's helped their spouse or their child, for example. And it's kind of good to hear these sort of stories. I also get people asking, where they can buy them from, for example, or whether I can provide them. And obviously, I can't provide them, as a service or as a medicine because it's not
Yeah.
regulated. We do
Yeah.
have a research program here in Cairns where part of our research is to maintain the parasite in healthy donors, because we obviously need to keep the parasite going because it's not endemic in Australia. We need to keep it going in our lab mates here. So, we do have research programs where people can, act as what's called worm farms for maintaining the parasite. And there's no shortage of people who want to volunteer for that in Cairns. But elsewhere of that, we can't obviously provide them. We understand people do get them from various forums and communities. You can purchase them from various sources online from overseas, for example. And obviously, it's not regulated. I don't necessarily encourage it, but if people want to do it, they can, because we know by experience that, we produce our worms in a very carefully clean laboratory setting. And even, using our best practices, we do get variability in, the quality of the worms we get out. And, you would worry potentially about, what you're getting from certain providers may not be the best quality. Nevertheless, some people swear by them. And if it is helping people, then that's great. And we know that in general, these worms aren't going to be harmful for people. You don't necessarily get debilitating symptoms, and there's minimal risk of transmitting the infection, pretty much zero risk of transmitting the infection to, people you live with or the community. So in general, it's a fairly safe, alternative approach to treating certain diseases. And I do hear some, interesting stories, or I get some very interesting questions from people in the community who, want to know how to monitor their symptoms or how to best produce their parasites, for example. But and I'm always happy to hear these sort of anecdotal stories from the community.
Okay. And what about the trials that were done with colitis and I think it was Crohn's disease and colitis? Is
Mm-hmm.
that right? What were the results? Was there any indication that it would be beneficial there?
Yeah, so this was really followed up only with these pig whipworms, the Trichuris suis ovis and the ovum, TSO. So there was a lot of emphasis behind this because you can produce those as a safe medicine because it's not infectious. You can produce it in the GMP conditions, and it was picked up by pharmaceutical and industry backing. And they did these larger randomized controlled trials relatively recently. There was a number of them. And the study outcomes, I think, were that it was a negative outcome. There was no clear benefit in Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. And that kind of put a bit of it kind of soured the potential for producing these pig whipworms as a potential cure for colitis. I think it's a situation where they might help some people, but they don't help everyone. And I think for colitis, that's reasonable because no one really knows what causes colitis. It's a very heterogeneous disease. People are very different in the types of inflammation they have, for example, and what causes it and what medications they're on. So it's a very high hill to climb to cure colitis. So I wasn't kind of surprised that the TSO didn't really provide a clear benefit. And at this stage, it would have to be a very large, high-powered study to really demonstrate any clinical benefit.
Okay. So, yeah, as you said, it sounds like people who have these conditions are not the same. They're all individually different.
Yeah. Again, it comes down to personalized medicine. If you find that the cause of, for colitis, for example, we know that some people with colitis have deficiencies in mucus production in their gut. So if they don't produce enough mucus, you don't have that protective layer, which means your bacteria can get in contact with your gut wall and cause inflammation. So we know that these TSO parasites produce mucus production. So there's potential that, for some people who have a certain cause of their colitis, absolutely, a worm infection they know that produces mucus, that might be a benefit. But for other people who don't have that deficit, they're probably not going to help. So it comes down to, again, learning more about the causes of the disease, the etiologies, and having a more personalized sort of medicine approach rather than just a broad spectrum giving an anti-inflammatory or some sort of product to all, because it's probably not going to help everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, I think we'll finish it off there, Paul.
That's great.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing this really fascinating research. It's such an interesting piece of the puzzle that I think we find ourselves in, and I'm definitely going to stay tuned to see what other research you come up with. So,
Great.
yeah, I wish you all the best. I hope you found this interview with Dr. Paul Giacomin as interesting as I did. In the next couple of interviews, I'm going to be speaking to people who actually turned to helminthic therapy to try to overcome severe food intolerances and allergies. Our first guest is going to be a mum whose young daughter was suffering from food reactions and severe eczema when she tried helminthic therapy. But did it work? Join us next time to find out.